Have you ever kept a journal? And did anyone ever read it without your permission?
After forgetting my birthday again, Mom walked into the kitchen with the same calm smile she always wore when she wanted to cover something up, set a chipped mug in front of me, and said almost too softly, "Here's some tea, just for you." For a second, I wanted to believe her, I really did. I wanted to think that maybe this was her way of making up for ignoring me all day, for skipping over the one moment in the year that was supposed to belong to me, for acting like it was just another Tuesday when every part of me screamed that it wasn't. But instead of lifting the mug to my lips, I slid it across the table toward my sister, thanked Mom like I was grateful, and watched as my sister, so smug, so sure she was the golden one, lifted it without hesitation and took a sip. A minute later, her throat tightened, her face flushed, and she began to gasp for air while clutching the edge of the table. I didn't move. I didn't even blink. And what struck me harder than her gasping was the way Mom stood there, perfectly still, perfectly silent, watching, almost as if this was the moment she had been waiting for. That's the part people never understand when I tell them my story. They want to assume I overreacted, that I misread something, that maybe Mom was just distracted. But I didn't misread anything. I saw it as clearly as I've ever seen anything in my life. The stillness on her face wasn't shock, it wasn't horror, it wasn't even worry, it was recognition. It was the calm relief of someone who had finally seen their plan fall into place, only it had fallen on the wrong daughter. And in that moment, I understood something I had spent my whole life refusing to admit. Forgetting my birthday wasn't forgetfulness at all. It was her way of reminding me where I stood, of reinforcing my place in the family hierarchy. I wasn't forgotten, I was erased. I grew up in the shadow of my sister Emily. If she so much as sneezed, it was a family event. Straight as on her report card? Dinner out. A college acceptance letter? Champagne in the fridge. A job interview? Good luck banners taped across the living room wall. But me? My first honor roll certificate was folded in half on the kitchen counter, unread, under a grocery list. My birthday gifts, when they came at all, were hand-me-down sweaters or something that looked suspiciously like it had been rewrapped from last Christmas. I used to tell myself it didn't matter, that some kids had it worse, that maybe I should just be grateful there was food on the table. But deep down, every dismissal chipped away at me until I felt like a ghost sitting at my own family's table, speaking words no one heard. Over the years, I learned to play my role. I laughed when Emily was praised. I swallowed my jealousy when Mom looked at her with that glow I never saw directed at me, and I accepted scraps of attention like they were favors I didn't deserve. By the time I was in my 20s, I was convinced the only way to survive was to stop expecting anything at all. Still, birthdays hurt. Birthdays weren't just about cake or presents, they were about acknowledgement, about saying, "I see you, you exist, you matter." Every year that passed with silence from Mom was another year she reminded me that, to her, I didn't. This year was no different, or so I thought. The day started without so much as a text. By evening, I had sat through dinner while Emily chattered on about some new project at work, while Mom nodded proudly, asking questions, hanging on every word. Not once did she look at me. Not once did she mention the date. I excused myself, pretending I was tired, and tried to let it go, like I had a dozen times before. And then, as I sat in the kitchen scrolling mindlessly through my phone, Mom appeared with that mug, her voice soft, her words measured. "Here's some tea, just for you." It was the way she emphasized "just for you" that caught me off guard. Mom wasn't the type to single me out. She never gave me the spotlight unless it was to highlight a flaw. Something in her tone felt staged, too deliberate, like she was playing a role she had rehearsed in her head. My gut twisted, and even as I reached for the mug, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't about kindness at all. It was about control. People ask me sometimes why I handed the tea to Emily. The truth is, it wasn't planned. It wasn't some grand scheme I had been cooking up for months. It was instinct, the kind of instinct you get after years of being left out, years of watching every gesture, every glance, every subtle change in tone because you know you're not safe otherwise. When Emily smirked at me across the table, like she always did when she thought Mom was finally doing something for me, I smiled right back and said, "You take it. You deserve it more than me." She took the cup without hesitation, because of course she did. She never believed she could be the target, never even entertained the thought. Within a minute, she was gasping, her eyes wide, her nails scraping at the table, her body betraying her. And Mom, standing there, didn't lunge forward, didn't panic, didn't scream. She just stood there, her hands folded, her expression flat. That's when it hit me. I had been right all along. For years I told myself it was forgetfulness, it was carelessness, it was favoritism that stung but wasn't lethal. I told myself I was exaggerating, that Mom wasn't cruel, she was just inattentive. But standing there, watching her eyes stay fixed on Emily, not moving a muscle to help, I realized the truth I should have seen a long time ago. It wasn't that she forgot my birthday again. It was that she never intended for me to live long enough to see another one. And once that truth landed in my chest, cold and heavy, I knew the story wasn't just about neglect anymore. It was about survival. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't the one left powerless. When I tell people about my childhood, the first reaction I usually see in their eyes is disbelief, because to anyone on the outside looking in, my family seemed normal enough, maybe even enviable, the kind of family where the yard was always trimmed. The house smelled of dinner cooking, and the kids looked well-fed and well-dressed, but what outsiders never saw was the slow erosion that came with being treated like the extra, the leftover, the one who existed only to serve as contrast against. The shining favorite, and that was Emily, the daughter who could do no wrong, the one who always had a light shined on her every achievement, while I was left to grow like a weed in the cracks, unwatered and unacknowledged. I could give you an endless list of examples, and every single one carries the same sting even now, years later, because the pattern was so obvious, yet for the longest time I tried to convince myself that it wasn't intentional. That maybe Mom was just forgetful, that maybe. She was tired or overwhelmed, but deep down I knew there was no innocence in the way she dismissed me, no accident in the way she looked at Emily like she was the prize and at me like I was some half-formed mistake. Take birthdays, for instance. Emily's birthdays were week-long productions, with balloons taped to every corner, elaborate cakes baked with her favorite flavors, presents stacked so high they spilled off the dining room table, and endless photographs taken as though each year of her life was a national holiday. Mine, on the other hand, were always reduced to afterthoughts. One year, I got a card with no money inside, no present, not even a cake, and when I asked about it, Mom shrugged and said we were too busy this week and promised to do something later, a promise that of course never materialized. Another year, I came downstairs hopeful to find something waiting, but all I found was a grocery bag with generic cookies and a sticky note that read, "Happy belated." I ate the cookies quietly while Emily paraded through the kitchen showing off the new necklace she had received, just because from Mom the day before. Even then, I told myself it was just bad timing, just poor planning, but the truth was obvious. My life events were never important enough to be celebrated. School achievements were the same story. When Emily was accepted into her college of choice, Mom threw a dinner party, invited relatives, even gave a speech about how proud she was to have raised such a brilliant daughter. When I was accepted into mine, a good school, not Ivy League, but respectable nonetheless, I was told, "That's nice," before the conversation shifted back to Emily's plans for her dorm decor. Once, when I brought home a report card with straight A's, I left it on the kitchen counter expecting at least a small word of acknowledgement, but it sat there under a pile of junk mail for 3 days until I finally slid it into the trash. When Emily brought home her own report card, also good, but no better than mine, Mom taped it to the refrigerator door like it was a family treasure, pointing it out to every visitor who stepped foot into the house. The favoritism bled into every corner of life, from holidays to casual conversations. Christmas mornings were torture, not because of what I did or didn't get, but because of the way gifts were given. Emily's pile was always wrapped in shiny paper, bows perfectly tied, boxes stacked neatly, while mine came in recycled gift bags with the tags from last year still stuck to the handles. She always got exactly what she asked for, the expensive perfume, the designer shoes, the latest phone, while I received whatever had been on sale the week before. One Christmas, I asked for a winter coat, something warm enough to get me through the season, and what I unwrapped was a coat 2 sizes too big, obviously secondhand, while Emily opened a brand new leather jacket, tags still attached, and the room filled with Mom's laughter and admiration. It's easy to dismiss these things when you list them out, to think they're just petty grievances, the kind of sibling rivalry everyone experiences, but what people don't understand is that when this becomes the daily reality, when the imbalance is so constant and so blatant, it stops being about presents or parties and starts being about identity. It sends you the message that you don't matter, that you are less valuable, that the space you take up in this family is begrudged, tolerated rather than welcomed. And when that message is reinforced year after year, it doesn't just sting in the moment, it reshapes the way you see yourself, the way you measure your worth. Looking back, I can see how carefully it was all orchestrated, even if I couldn't admit it then. Mom would praise Emily in public and critique me in private, always in small doses, always enough to keep me silent, but never enough to draw outside suspicion. If Emily and I argued, Mom took her side without question. If something went missing in the house, I was the first one blamed. If Emily was late, excuses were made on her behalf. If I was late, punishment was swift. It wasn't just favoritism, it was conditioning, a subtle but relentless campaign to remind me every day that I was expendable. I think the moment I finally allowed myself to admit the truth came during one of Emily's birthdays, when she was turning 21. Mom had rented out a restaurant, filled the tables with family and friends, and made a toast so saccharine it almost made me laugh, declaring Emily to be the best thing that ever happened to her. I sat there in the corner, nursing a drink, and in that instant, it hit me, she wasn't exaggerating. She meant it. To her, Emily was the only daughter worth loving, the only one worth celebrating, the only one worth protecting. And me? I was the mistake she could barely bring herself to acknowledge. That realization might have crushed me completely if not for the flicker of something else that sparked inside me that night. It wasn't self-pity or despair, it was anger, sharp and undeniable. Anger at years of being sidelined, anger at the way my existence was treated like an inconvenience, anger that built and built until it hardened into something steadier, something I didn't yet recognize as resolve. That's when I started paying attention, not just to what was happening around me, but to the cracks in the mask Mom wore, to the moments when her smile faltered, when her voice slipped, when I caught her watching me with an expression I couldn't quite name. At first, I told myself it was paranoia, that I was imagining things, but the more I noticed, the more certain I became. There were moments when I walked into a room and conversations stopped. Moments when I found things in my room that I hadn't left there. Moments when Mom's voice carried a note of disdain so sharp it cut through her usual feigned politeness. These weren't accidents. They were signs. And though I didn't want to admit it back then, I can see it now with perfect clarity. The betrayals weren't just about favoritism or neglect. They were rehearsals, small tests of how much I could endure, steps toward something darker. And sitting here now, thinking about that mug of tea, about the calm way she placed it in front of me, about the relief in her eyes when Emily began to gasp instead of me, I know without question that I wasn't imagining anything. The truth had been there all along, layered into every betrayal, every dismissal, every quiet moment when she made it clear that she wished I weren't there at all. The moment that cup touched the table in front of me, I knew something was wrong, though for years I had forced myself to silence those instincts, to laugh off the unease that always accompanied my mother's sudden moments of so-called kindness. But this time the air between us carried a weight I could not ignore, and when she leaned forward with that strange softness in her voice, saying, "Here's some tea, just for you," it felt less like a gesture of care and more like the final act of a play. She had been rehearsing behind closed doors for longer than I could admit to myself. I had spent my entire life being conditioned to doubt my own worth, to believe that every slight and dismissal was my imagination, that my mother's endless favoritism toward Emily was natural, harmless, something I simply had to endure. Yet in that instant, as I stared down at the steaming cup, the illusion cracked, and I saw her for what she was: calm, deliberate, controlled, and above all, expectant. I cannot tell you that I had a plan in that moment, because the truth is I didn't. What I had was instinct, sharpened by years of neglect, a kind of survival sense that children of favoritism grow up with. The knowledge that you are always on thinner ice than the one beside you, that you must anticipate danger because no one will save you when it comes. Emily sat across the table, her eyes gleaming with the same mixture of triumph and condescension she had worn her entire life, and for a second I almost laughed, because even then, even in that charged moment, she thought the mug was some small gesture of my mother finally recognizing me, and she couldn't resist being jealous of it. So when I slid the cup across the table toward her and said in the most casual tone I could manage, "You take it, you deserve it more than me," I knew she would not hesitate, because that had always been her nature, to take. To assume everything offered in this family belonged to her by right, to believe she was invincible. She lifted the cup, she drank without question, and within moments her body betrayed her. First it was the flicker of confusion in her eyes, then the tightening of her throat as her hand rose instinctively to her neck, then the desperate gasps for air as she realized that something as ordinary as tea had turned against her. Chairs scraped, voices rose, the room tilted into chaos, but I stayed seated, my hands steady in my lap, my eyes fixed not on Emily but on Mom, because if anyone in that room was worth watching, it was her. And what I saw on her face was not panic or grief or fear, but something colder, something that chilled me far more than Emily's gasping ever could. I saw a flicker of disappointment, followed by a mask of stillness so perfect it was terrifying. She didn't flinch. She didn't move. She didn't even glance at me. She simply watched, as though the wrong actress had spoken the line, as though the script had been followed, but the roles had been reversed. The others didn't notice it, too distracted by Emily's convulsions, but I noticed, because I had been trained my entire life to notice the things others overlooked. I saw the absence of reaction, the deliberate calm, the way her lips pressed together not in horror but in calculation. It was then that I understood what I had refused to accept for so many years, that the endless neglect had been building toward this, that the forgotten birthdays, the dismissed achievements, the cold shoulders were not merely signs of favoritism, but steps toward erasure, each one normalizing the idea that I did not belong, that I could disappear and no one would question it. And in that moment, as Emily gasped for air and Mom remained still, I realized with absolute clarity that the tea was not just a drink. It was meant to be my ending. I think what startled me most was not the betrayal itself. I had always known, somewhere deep down, that my mother's love was conditional, perhaps even absent, but the serenity I felt as the truth crystallized. There was no panic, no urge to cry out or defend myself, only a quiet certainty that I had finally seen her without disguise, and that by a twist of instinct, by a single decision to pass that cup across the table, the entire balance of power had shifted in a way she could never undo. For the first time in my life, I wasn't the one left powerless. I was the one holding the truth, and the truth was this: she had chosen her target, she had revealed her intent, and she had failed. Emily's gasps echoed in the room, hands reached for her, shouts filled the air, but still I kept my eyes on Mom, and when our gazes finally met, it was as though years of unspoken battles were compressed into that single look. Her eyes, usually so quick to burn with scorn, carried something different now, something I had never seen before and would never forget. It wasn't love. It wasn't remorse. It was fear. And as I sat there, unflinching, silent, watching her mask slip for just a fraction of a second, I knew that my life had changed forever, not because of what Emily was enduring at that table, but because of what I had seen in my mother's face. The unmistakable realization that I was no longer her victim, that I had survived her final move, and that survival itself was the beginning of my revenge. The sound of Emily's gasping still lingers in my mind like a broken record that refuses to stop playing, a harsh reminder of the chaos that exploded in that room the moment her body betrayed her. Yet what remains etched even deeper than her desperate clawing at her own throat is the stillness of my mother, who, while the rest of the family rushed forward in frantic panic, stayed rooted to the spot as if she had been waiting her whole life for this exact moment. And that stillness, more than the Gasps or the shouts or the scraping of chairs against the floor told me everything I needed to know. For so long, I had wondered if I was exaggerating the coldness in her eyes or the deliberate way she erased me from the family's narrative, but watching her then, hands folded, lips pressed into a line, eyes steady on Emily's flailing form, I understood with a clarity that left me both shaken and strangely calm that nothing had ever been accidental, that every forgotten birthday, every discarded achievement, every moment of silence when I had begged for acknowledgement had been rehearsal for this, a slow and steady stripping away of my place in the family until it became plausible, inevitable even, that I might simply not exist anymore. The room itself became a storm I refused to enter. Because the relatives screamed for someone to call for help, Emily's boyfriend shouted instructions that no one followed, and my father, though visibly shaken, fumbled like a man unable to process that his perfect daughter could ever be reduced to this helpless, writhing state. But through it all I sat perfectly still, my chair pushed back just enough to give me a full view of both Emily and my mother, as if my body understood that the only position of power available to me was to remain an observer, to deny them the satisfaction of watching me flail or panic or beg. I remember one aunt screaming at me to do something, her voice sharp with accusation, but I only lifted my eyes briefly to her before turning back to my mother, silently daring her to acknowledge that this wasn't chance, that I had stolen the ending she had written for me and handed it to the daughter she had always cherished. There was a moment, brief but undeniable, when Mom's eyes met mine, and in that flicker of contact I saw the collapse of the narrative she had clung to for years, the certainty that I would always be the expendable one, the quiet shadow who would never defy the script, and for the first time in all the years I had been alive, I saw fear in her, not of discovery, because she was too careful to ever let anyone see what she was capable of, but fear of me. Fear that by surviving I had rewritten the rules of our relationship in a way that left her vulnerable, exposed, and no longer in control. When the paramedics finally arrived, when the blur of flashing lights reflected against the walls and Emily was carried out on a stretcher, I remained seated, silent, calm, because there was no role for me in the chaos, and I had no intention of being drawn into the performance my family was so eager to stage, where tears would be shed and blame would be deflected and questions would be buried under the pretense of tragedy. I let them scramble, I let them cry, I let them look at me with suspicion that they were too afraid to put into words, because I understood something they did not. Silence was no longer weakness, it was power, and the less I explained, the less I reacted. The more they would wonder what I knew, what I had seen, what I might be capable of. Later that night, when the house had emptied of relatives and the only sounds were the hum of the refrigerator and the faint buzz of the television left on in the other room, Mom finally approached me, her steps deliberate, her voice measured. And for once, she did not bother with the mask of affection or pretense. She didn't accuse me. She didn't scold. She didn't even mention Emily. She simply asked, "Why didn't you drink it?" And those 5 words confirmed every suspicion I had carried for years, every gnawing instinct I had silenced, every quiet fear I had buried in the hope that maybe, just maybe, I was wrong about her. I looked at her, and for once I didn't lower my eyes or scramble for an excuse or pretend not to understand. I held her gaze with a steadiness that surprised even me, and I let the silence stretch long enough to remind her that she no longer had control over how this story was told. I didn't answer her question, because there was no answer she deserved, no explanation that would give her comfort. Instead, I let her sit with the truth of what had just happened, the undeniable reality that she had failed, that the daughter she had spent a lifetime trying to erase had seen through her final move and survived it. And in that silence, I watched something shift in her, a recognition that the balance between us had changed forever, that whatever power she once held over me had cracked, and that from this moment forward, every word she spoke, every look she gave, every gesture she attempted would be filtered through the knowledge that I knew, that I had seen her intent with my own eyes, and that I wasn't afraid anymore. For the first time in my life, she was the one who had to wonder what I might do next, and I could see in her face how much that terrified her. In the days that followed, while Emily lay in the hospital recovering and the rest of the family spun themselves in circles, trying to make sense of what had happened. I carried myself with the same calm detachment that had settled over me the moment she gasped for air, because I knew that any sudden outburst, any attempt to defend myself or to accuse my mother outright, would only weaken the position I had earned. And what mattered most now was not proving anything to anyone but ensuring that the quiet shift of power that had occurred at that dinner table solidified into permanence. For years, I had been the daughter who swallowed her words, who tried to convince herself that being overlooked was survivable, who clung to the fantasy that neglect was somehow easier to endure than outright hatred. But after that cup of tea revealed everything, I realized that survival had already transformed into strategy, and that my silence, my composure, my refusal to play into her narrative had become my most dangerous weapon. Mom tried, of course, to pretend nothing had changed, because that was her way, to mask content with routine, to cloak venom in civility, and so she moved through the house with the same calm gestures, cooking meals, folding laundry, answering calls from relatives who demanded updates on Emily's condition. Yet every time she passed me in the hallway, I could feel the tension in her shoulders, the stiffness in her breath, the awareness that I was no longer the silent child who could be erased without consequence. She avoided my eyes, and when she finally did look at me, I could see it again, that flicker of fear that told me she was replaying the moment in her mind, wondering how I had known, how I had sensed, how I had chosen instinctively to hand the cup to Emily without hesitation. And though she never said the words aloud, I knew she suspected the truth, that her secret had been exposed, that her carefully constructed hierarchy of power had been dismantled not with shouting or confrontation, but with one simple act of refusal. The brilliance of it, though I say so myself, was that I never had to reveal anything explicitly. I never had to tell anyone that the tea was meant for me. I never had to accuse her of what I knew she had done, because the silence itself became the story. The family whispered behind closed doors, some daring to suggest that maybe I had known something, that maybe I had set Emily up, while others insisted that it was just an accident, that there was no way our mother could be capable of such intent. But the beauty of their doubt was that it worked in my favor, because every time the question arose, why didn't she drink it, the uncertainty thickened, and with it came suspicion. Not directed at me, but at the woman who had spent her life pretending she was incapable of cruelty. I didn't need to defend myself, I didn't need to explain, I didn't need to persuade, because the more I said nothing, the more others filled in the blanks themselves. In private, she asked me once more, her voice sharper than before, her patience fraying, "Why did you give it to her?" And once again I refused to answer, because the silence was louder than anything I could have said, and in that silence I saw her unravel. Saw her recognize that the power she once wielded so easily had shifted into my hands. For the first time, she was forced to live with uncertainty, forced to wonder what I might reveal, what I might do, when I might decide to speak. Every gesture of hers became tentative, every word calculated, and though she still tried to maintain control over Emily and the rest of the family, I knew the truth. She was performing now, not ruling. What made the victory so sweet was that it didn't require destruction in the traditional sense. I didn't need to expose her, I didn't need to ruin her reputation or prove her guilt. Because the greatest punishment for someone like her was to live under the shadow of exposure, to wake up every morning with the knowledge that her secret had been witnessed, that she was no longer untouchable, that I had survived her final attempt to erase me and turned it into the very thing that trapped her. It was a masterstroke not of violence, but of survival, a reversal so subtle and so complete that it could never be undone, because once the fear of discovery takes root, it never leaves. Emily eventually recovered, though she was never quite the same, and while she tried to reclaim her role as the golden child, I could see in her eyes the hesitation that hadn't been there before. The doubt that crept in whenever she lifted a glass or accepted a plate of food from our mother's hand, and though she never admitted it, I knew she had felt the same chill I had lived with my whole life. And as for the rest of the family, they never said much, but the way they looked at me changed, not with affection, not with pity, but with something harder to define, something like respect edged with unease. As if they finally saw me not as the invisible daughter, but as the one who had survived what no one else could. To this day, no one knows exactly what happened. No one knows why I didn't drink the tea. No one knows whether I had planned it or whether it was instinct, and I have no intention of telling them, because the ambiguity is my shield and my victory all at once. They live with questions. She lives with fear. And I live with the certainty that after a lifetime of being erased, I carved my place into the story not with their approval, but with my own survival, my own refusal to play the role they wrote for me. And that is why, even now, when I look back on that night, I don't think of it as the evening my sister gasped for air or the evening my mother revealed her intent. I think of it as the evening I finally became untouchable, the evening I took the script that had been written for me, tore it in half, and rewrote it with my own hand, ensuring that for once and for all, I was no longer the forgotten daughter, but the one who could not be erased.